Feathers UI. Feathers was originally developed for Adobe Flash and Air using Starling Framework, but now I am working on a new version of Feathers written with Haxe and targeting OpenFL. With Feathers, what I'm looking to do is to allow developers to create user interfaces for various types of creative projects. Basically the kind of stuff that Flash has always been good for, so making games, interactive data visualizations like charts and graphs, and sort of interesting things that you might see on newspaper websites when they do some kind of deep dive into some data, and then just generally rich multimedia experiences. So one of my big goals with Feathers has always been to make it flexible for different types of projects. So for example, if you're making a game and maybe you just want a slider or something to change a little setting, you can pick only that component, or only a small set of components. You don't have to re-architect your entire code base just to fit Feathers in there. So you don't get the full weight of the full framework. The components are basically just subclasses of the display object class in OpenFL and previously Starling. So you can just call add child and add a Feathers component to a sprite or any other thing you're used to working with in OpenFL. But of course, if you want to, you can build a whole app using just Feathers components with all of the bells and whistles of containers, navigators, and things. So if you're familiar with Adobe Flex, which eventually became Apache Flex, I try to provide that sort of experience too, where enterprises or people building more appy things can really take advantage of a ton of components and capabilities. Additionally, I know, especially with creative projects, you're always targeting new types of devices and things, so I make sure that the APIs that are available are appropriate for each of those platforms. So, if you're making app for phones, it's going to be touchscreen centric, desktop more, mouse. Smart TVs, they might be working with a remote control. Consoles, you have a game controller. So I want to make sure all the components can be used in each of those environments. If you're focusing just on one, then there are features you can enable that might not be appropriate for other environments, and you have a lot of options available to you. So Feathers comes with a ton of different components. Here we have some of the basics. We have buttons, we have text inputs, we have sliders, labels, checkboxes, toggle switches, just for basic form actions, or for games and things. A setting a screen with where you can toggle things and change whatever you need. If you're going a little more on the app-centric side, there's a lot of components that render data. So, a basic scrolling list, data grids. Here we have a date chooser and a tree as just some of the examples. And then there's a whole lot more too. A lot more than I wanted to collect enough screenshots to show here, but yeah. Another thing that Feathers UI provides is different types of layouts for controlling how your UI components are positioned. So we have horizontal and vertical layouts. There's tiled layouts, and some interesting, more advanced ones. The one on the bottom right there is called the waterfall layout, and you might have seen this type of layout on websites like Pinterest and things like that. And so like the lists and various containers can all make use of these layouts to show whatever data or whatever you're trying to display and whatever is most appropriate for your use cases. And there's various other features of the layouts that you can make use of, such as setting the width of an object. You can set it in pixels. You say I want to be 100 pixels wide, or you can set it in percentages, which is based on what like the width of the parent container is. So you say you want it to be 50% of the width, then you want to center it and things like that. That's possible too. There's also like an anchor or constraint layout, which allows you to position objects relative to, for example, the edges of the container. So you want to have, some little notification always appear, 10 pixels from the bottom and 20 pixels from the right. You can do that, and then when the container resizes, it'll automatically keep it that far away from the edge. And additionally, there's the ability to center as well, vertically or horizontally. In the data components like lists and data grids and things, there's support for virtualization. Sometimes it's called recycling, which basically means that it will only display the views that are actually visible without scrolling, and then as you scroll, it'll reuse those views to have them display more data. So that improves performance, and then basically like if you had some kind of infinite scrolling sort of situation, like you could just keep going, and it would not start getting bogged down as you got more and more items to display. And then, like I just said, infinite scrolling is possible, and even looping. So once you get to the end, it'll restart all the items that were at the beginning as well. Feathers also supports styling and theming. They're just regular properties on the classes for the feathers components, so you're not passing strings to like a set style and get style type function, which can't be checked very easily by the compiler. The 2 bits of example code there where like you're just passing in a bitmap to the background skin of the button, and that's how you get it in, and then internally it'll add it to this playlist and things like that. One of the things I've always tried to do is make sure that if the built-in skinning display objects in Feathers don't provide enough for you, you should be able to pass in any display object from OpenFL, and it will be usable as a skin. So, you can use a bitmap, you can use a sprite, you can even use Feathers components as skins. For example, like on a slider component, you have the thumb, you have the track. Sometimes, like when you click or touch one of these subcomponents, you want it to change state like a button, so you can use a button for that sort of thing. Additionally, styles can be customized in stateful components. So, buttons can have a hover state, a down state, disabled. Text inputs can, change state change their appearance when they're focused and that sort of thing. So there are APIs to say, okay, here's my default skin, but if I go into this state, use this one instead. If there's some state that doesn't define a skin, then just go back to the default. And then finally, there's the ability to package up the styles and skins for that are all sort of part of the same design into a theme. And I'll talk a little bit more about themes later because I'm making some interesting improvements for the Haxe and OpenFL version. So I just wanted to cover some of the things that I'll be changing and improving in this version. Some things that I found interesting from Haxe that I wanted there that helped improve the APIs in Feathers, and I thought it would be interesting to share what those are and how they make Feathers better. Just starting from a basic, not necessarily Haxe or OpenFL specific area, but I'm taking advantage of the opportunity to improve some of the naming in Feathers. So a couple of examples here. We have the stack screen navigator component. I just said, hey, let's just call it stack navigator. Less to type, and it still gives you enough information to know what's going on. Some of the properties in Feathers, I used a style for Boolean properties where I added the is before in the Starling version, and I just decided to simplify that, so is enabled just becomes enabled. And then there were a couple things where, just due to differences in, between ActionScript and Haxe or Starling and OpenFL, I needed to make a couple of tweaks to names. So Haxe has a list data structure, and the list component in Feathers has the same name, and I didn't want to have that conflicting, so I decided to call it listbox. Similarly, OpenFL has like an invalidate function for all display objects, and Feathers has a system for batching all of the updates to various properties that you change in one go before each frame is rendered, and that was also called invalidate. So I changed that to set invalid. One of the things that was kind of tricky about using Feathers and Starling was choosing how to render the text in your components. You could use device fonts or embedded fonts. You could use bitmap fonts. I exposed the Flash text engine as another way of rendering vector fonts, and so there were these interfaces, iText renderer and iText editor, that were sort of simplifying the API and like making them all work under the same thing, but it was kind of a pain to deal with. So the OpenFL version is just going to use just a regular text field, and that should make things a lot easier going forward. So I wanted to show some examples of how the theming is improving and changing, and what you can expect from styling and skinning going forward. One of the things that I'll be adding is a default theme that will be enabled as soon as you create a button or a slider or whatever component you need, which will have just a pretty basic style, but enough that it'll make a Hello World application easier than it was in Starling, because in the Starling version, nothing was skinned by default, and you either had to grab one of the example themes or skin it yourself. So this should help the getting started experience be better, not only for new users, but additionally just any developer that's already experienced doesn't have to set up as much in a new project as they used to. Obviously, one of the most important things of having a default theme is being able to disable it and replace it with whatever one you prefer, and that's going to be as simple as setting a property to false, and then it won't be skinned at all. On the other hand, while you're working on a new design, or if you just want to make a few tweaks here and there, you can decide that you only want to skin some of the components but leave the others as default, and that's fine. And sort of the same idea where you like most of the styles on a particular component, but you want to tweak one or two things, that will be possible too. You can either do that by setting the property directly in your app, or you can create a custom theme that then says, okay, I want the default theme to do this, and then I'll change this. And then I'm going to make sure that the default theme has both a light mode and a dark mode, so that it's easy to match what sort of vibe you're looking for. Plus, dark mode is very cool these days, apparently. One thing that was a little bit tricky in the Starling version of Feathers was being able to switch themes at runtime. So, you know, you might want the users of your app to be able to customize how everything looks in there, or you know, maybe a certain part of your app might need to look different than everything else. And so one of my focuses is making sure that it's easy to just say, okay, get rid of this theme and switch to this other one instead, and it will automatically change all of the components that are currently on stage, and then obviously any new ones that get created later. So it will actually go in and clear all the styles that were set by the previous theme to whatever the default state is for Feathers, except if you, outside of a theme, decided to customize something. So if you decide, okay, I want this button to always use a specific font no matter what theme I'm using, you can do that, and then switching themes will still keep those settings there, whereas previously it was a little bit more tricky to do that sort of thing. And so once all the styles get cleared out, the new theme starts fresh, and your app just switches over seamlessly. In my demo later, I'll show that happening. And then one thing that I remember was with the Starling version, there was a community member who made an app called Starling Builder, which was kind of like a drag and drop interface for views, and he was using Feathers for the UI, but he also wanted to make sure that you could drag and drop Feathers components in the editor and use whatever your game or app skins were within the editor, but have the outer editor have whatever his theme was for just the editor. And so I'm making sure that it's possible that a theme can apply to the entire app, or you can have a specific container that is using a different theme. One thing that wasn't very common in Starling was using vector graphics. You basically always loaded up some kind of bitmap and turned it into a texture, and that's how you skinned Feathers components for the most part. OpenFL makes vector graphics a little bit easier. They seem to perform pretty well in my experience so far. And so I'm making sure that there are skins available that make it easy to have the graphics drawn at runtime and be customizable. And so right now I have 3 classes that I've created that'll be just sort of like common skins that you can easily grab and customize a few things and have your app looking pretty good. So there's a rectangle skin, there's a circle skin, and ellipse skin. That isn't to say that these are your only options. You can certainly create custom skins that draw whatever crazy shape or have different layers of vector graphics, you know, to add like a highlight or a shadow or whatever you need. But these will be a good starting point as you customize things. As part of this, I wanted to make sure that you could customize the actual graphics that were being drawn with the graphics APIs. So I created these fill styles and line styles, which, as you can see, will map to the graphics drawing calls that are used on the display list. So you can specify just a plain solid color, you can use a gradient, and you can use a bitmap. For fills, that ends up calling the begin fill function on the graphics object, or begin gradient fill, or begin bitmap fill. Similarly for the line styles. So let's look at a little bit of code that shows how you would use these APIs. So we create a new rectangle skin. We give it a fill. In this case, it's just a solid color, which we get from the fill style enumeration. We can customize the color. There's the ability to customize the alpha. Basically, it's the different things you can customize map to what the parameters of those function calls were on the previous slide. Similarly, we're using the line style for the border of the skin. kind of what I was talking about before. You can customize the fill or the line style based on the current state of the component, if it is a component that has state. So in this case, we're skinning a button. So we're saying, okay, we want the color of the fill to change when the button is down from pressing it with the mouse or a touch. In the case of rectangle skin, you can specify a corner radius, and then you just pass it in. And one thing I wanted to point out, because it was something that I didn't realize at first, and then some folks I was chatting with were like, well, can you simplify how you pass in the fill style or the line style? Do you need to include fill style dot or line style dot beforehand? And we discovered that no, it's not really required, because they're simple enumerations, so you can actually omit them. And in this case, you can see that in both cases we're using solid color, but the Haxe compiler is able to just automatically infer that, okay, this one on the top is for the fill because that's what it's being assigned to, and the one at the bottom is for the line style because it's being assigned to border, which is typed as line style. And so even though they have the same name and different arguments, it's all able to work out. And I think that's pretty cool. And then another thing I worked on in the last week or two was making some improvements to the Stack Navigator component. If you haven't used this before, this is basically a way to navigate between different views. You might use it to set up different menus in a game or something like that. It has a history so that as you go to new pages or new screens, it'll remember what it was at previously, so when you go back, it'll go back through that history. And then it also has animated transitions, so that screens can slide in or out together, or whatever effect you want. It could be fading in, fading out, and things like that. So there's 3 different ways to create items for the Stack Navigator. You can pass in the class for your view, and then when that view is asked to be shown, it will create an instance of that class and display it. You can actually create your view beforehand and just pass in the variable. And so then every time that particular view is supposed to be shown, it will keep using the same instance, so then it can keep state. There's also ways to keep state when you're instantiating a new version every time. It's just kind of a trade-off on how exactly you want to do it. And then finally, you can pass in a function that returns a new view. So I did not include this in the code example here, but if you wanted to set some properties on your view before you return it, this would be a good way to do it. And so if you were using like the same class for 2 different views and you just wanted to tweak a couple of properties to change how that class behaves, you could do it this way. And so for one of the things that Haxe was able to help me improve with the Stack Navigator was how you specify actions for your views. So when your view dispatches an event, what do you do next? Do you want to navigate to a new screen? Do you want to go back in the history to the previous screen? Do you want to go all the way back to the first view that was shown? Do you want to replace the current screen with a new screen, but then when you go back, don't go to the current screen, go to the one that was before it, that sort of thing. You can also just forward it to the event to a function and handle that however you please, or you can even use an event listener that will decide, based on whatever the properties of your event are, to choose an action dynamically. And so to specify these actions, I am using the map class, where the string is an event type and then the action is another enumeration of the various things that the Stack Navigator can do. So if we look at the code, here's a pretty complex screen that has various actions. So We're saying, okay, the view is going to use the MyScreen class. When it dispatches checkout event.next, we want to go to the next step in the process. If it dispatches previous, we want to go back in history to whatever it was before that. If it dispatches cancel, then we're going to go all the way to the first screen that the Navigator showed, because we're completely leaving the checkout process in this example store here. When the order is complete, we want to show some kind of confirmation to the user, so we're going to replace the current screen with that confirmation. But if they go back from that confirmation page, we don't want to go back into our checkout steps because they've already made the purchase, and it wouldn't make sense to show that history again. And then finally on the bottom, you can see an example of just calling an event listener. So if there's some kind of debug event, we can call this function and do with that whatever we want. All right, so now I want to show you a little demo of what I've been able to get converted over to Haxe and OpenFL so far. So here is a little app with the various components that I've converted. Oh, I gotta hop out of here. There we go. Okay. All right, so here is a simple app I've built. We have the list of the components that are currently available. They each have their own screen that shows off the components. So if we go into the button screen here, we have a button and a toggle button. So it's just a regular push button. We have a toggle button that keeps a selected state, which gets toggled when you click or tap it. You'll see as I hit the back button, we have an animated transition that goes between the different views. It's using the Stack Navigator with the API that I was showing there. Here's just a simple label component for displaying text. There's different styles of labels that you can create. One thing I didn't talk about with the theming is the idea of a variant. So at the top here, you see the basic label component with a medium font size, but you can there are a couple of built-in variants for label where you can have one be a heading or one can be a detail, which has larger or smaller font size respectively. And you can even create your own custom variants if that's what your app needs. Here we have just a simple list box. I have it working in the style of a more mobile touch experience, so you just kind of tap and drag on it. So you can see I've implemented the elastic edges there, and things are performing pretty well on both desktop and mobile. At least with the native apps, and very, very well on desktop on the web as well. We have a basic slider component. There's a horizontal version and a vertical version. And we have a text input component where you can type in whatever you want there. And then here I have a button that I've added here where it's going to get rid of the current theme, which is the current default light style theme, and switch it to a different theme, which is the dark mode theme. So just have a button click there and it switches over. And we can see all of the components have a dark style there. So the question is, if you create a custom component, is there some kind of flag or something to have it respond to theme changes? So when you define a property that's meant to be a style, there will be some metadata that you can add to it, and then the core feathers architecture will be able to detect each property that's a style, and it will know to clear it out and set it back to the default. And then obviously the new theme that can then replace it with the new style, or if it's not going to set all the styles, that's fine too. You can set up proper defaults if needed. Okay. Oops, not that one. Okay. So probably by the end of June, I'm hoping to start up a crowdfunding campaign to help give me the opportunity to continue working on this port of Feathers from ActionScript to Haxe and to OpenFL. What this campaign will do, it'll probably be on Kickstarter. It's going to help fund the port of all of the open source parts of Feathers. And what's built into Feathers now with the ActionScript version will continue to be available with the Haxe version. And then another thing that I'm planning to do is create some kind of additional premium content, which the idea is that a year from now or whenever all the Kickstarter funds run out, I'm gonna I still need to fix bugs and add features and create new components and stuff. So I want to make sure that this premium content is available to developers to not only get useful additional components and things, but to help fund continued development. So as examples of premium components, I'm thinking about creating charts and graphs. An idea I had recently was creating some kind of like barcode or QR code renderer for OpenFL, a calendar component. The sort of things that not every app is going to need it, but when you do, it's really helpful to just get it all in one package. Lots of good documentation, and examples and things like that. I'll also be looking into creating some kind of screencasts, which walk you through the process of setting up projects or using certain components or using certain APIs, and probably ebooks that kind of focus on various specific topics for how to develop things with Feathers. And so as part of the crowdfunding campaign, those who contribute at various levels will gain access to some of these premium components. So, at one level you might get the first premium component that I've built. At a higher level you might get 3, and then I think there's a highest level where it's like, well, as long as I keep making premium components, you're gonna get them all. And so more information about my plans for this campaign are at this URL. There's a form at the bottom of the page where you can sign up for email notifications about when it launches. And hopefully with the community's help, Feathers can be successful in this new environment and help you build your games, your apps, and various other creative projects that you would want to use it for. So the question is, does Feathers have the ability to handle displays with different pixel densities? Yes, it does. It detects what the pixel density is and figures out how to automatically scale your apps so that you can work in points or density pixels instead of just normal pixels. I don't think that is something I could show from the demo, but that was something that existed in the ActionScript version 2, and I've been making sure that's also available in the new OpenFL version. So, depending on whatever mobile device Feathers will be running on, you can scale it appropriately. So, buttons and things will always have a decent hit area and things like that. Yeah. The question is, will Feathers be able to handle fluid layouts depending on what the screen size is, so for different devices. So as an example, you might have a different layout on phones versus tablets versus desktop. There is some of that built in, so like being able to use percentages and things like that. I haven't come up with an idea for for basically what they call in the web responsive layouts. Like right now, it's basically like you're like, if you're on this device, then I'm going to use this layout. So you have to write that out specifically. I'd really like to come up with some kind of I don't know if it's a container or a layout or something where you can easily find that all in one place. I just haven't come up with something that I like. So it's not really tricky to do it right now, but I definitely want it to be easier.
It's tricky to do it right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yes. The question is how much of Feathers, or how much of Starling's API service does Feathers use? I would say it's probably a pretty decent amount of the API service. I generally try to make sure that Feathers is using what Starling or OpenFL exposes publicly, and not go too far into really low level stuff, going down to Lime or going down to more raw Air APIs in the Starling version, for example. But if you want to go to another library that has a display list that was inspired by flashes, then I think the OpenFL version will probably be the closest to that, since Starling was inspired by it, but it kind of went in its own direction in certain areas because it was more focused on providing more ideal APIs for GPUs, while OpenFL is more trying to provide the Flash API more exactly. The question is, does this use the OpenFL version of Starling, or is it directly on top of OpenFL? It is directly on top of OpenFL. So Starling is not in the middle there. The question is, what is my schedule for publishing the code? So I haven't exactly decided yet. At the very latest, it would be once the Kickstarter is funded. At the very latest, it could be earlier than that. I haven't had a chance to really figure out when the ideal time is for me yet. Yes.
So, can you share with us a little bit about your experience programming
So the question is, what can I share my experience of programming with Haxe? How long have I done it, and what's my experience been? So I have not been programming in Haxe very long. I would say I started exploring the idea of porting feathers over to Haxe within the last 5 or 6 months. But it was kind of like a slow ramping up process, whereas like, the last 2 weeks I've been doing it full time, and before it was whenever I found a moment. So I still, to a certain degree, I still consider myself a Haxe beginner. But at the same time, there's so many similarities to ActionScript or TypeScript or other languages like that I found it to be very easy to pick up. I had played around with Haxe a little bit like a couple years ago, and I just decided I wanted to stick with ActionScript. But now that things are changing with Flash and Air and everything else, I decided, I'm going to give Haxe another chance. And so far, like, the experience has been great. Like, I like all the little improvements that Haxe has that you wouldn't find in ActionScript, like the enumerations I was showing earlier for things like line styles and fill styles for the vector graphics, and for the stack navigator. I like the macros. I've done a little bit of work with compilers somewhat recently, and being able to jump into that compile step and customize things is pretty cool. I'm planning to do a little bit of that related to the styles, so that you don't have to write quite as much boilerplate code to set them up. So that I think that'll be fun.
You're already building an app like ours that's already built on top of Starlink. Are there some compelling reasons to go with the OpenFL version, or looking to
The question is, if you already have an app built on the Starling version of Feathers, is there a compelling reason to move over to this new OpenFL version? I think it depends on the project, but obviously there are a lot of advantages to Haxe and OpenFL. I think one of the biggest ones is that you have more types of devices you can target if you switch to this version versus Adobe Air, which is somewhat more constrained. Air is just iOS, Android, and Windows and Mac. Obviously, Flash Player used to be there, so you could target the web. But since that's being sunsetted, there's really no Flash way to get on the web anymore. So I think probably the biggest compelling thing is that you can get your app on the web. But then there's also new targets that you'll be able to access, like consoles and things like that. It obviously depends on your app. If you're making a game, then you want to be on consoles. If it's just a regular app, maybe not. I don't know. So would moving over to the OpenFL version have conflicts with the existing Starling code? Well, there would definitely be some changes you would have to make. Obviously, like I was mentioning, some things are being renamed in this new version of Feathers. I was thinking about possibly providing some kind of like compatibility layer, so you could load some extra classes that are a little bit closer to the old APIs if you just wanted to get something up and running more quickly, and then slowly migrate over to the new APIs and then get rid of the layer later. And then there are going to be differences between Starling and OpenFL as well, for as far as what APIs are exposed or exactly how things work. Because like I mentioned, like Starling tried to be a little more GPU aware in its APIs, and OpenFL is more matching the original Flash APIs. So there will be some tweaks there that will probably be necessary. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. Yeah, the suggestion was to look into Haxe Abstract to provide the legacy APIs because they provide little overhead, and I will check that out. All right, thank you.